In March of 2012, I was working as a saturation diver for an offshore oil company in the North Sea. For those unfamiliar with the work, saturation diving means living in a pressurized chamber for weeks at a time, making daily excursions to depths of 300 feet or more to repair underwater infrastructure. On March 14th, I was returning from a routine maintenance dive when something went catastrophically wrong with the diving bell. The winch system malfunctioned, and instead of a controlled ascent, we began plummeting toward the seabed at an alarming rate. My partner Marcus started screaming into the radio, but there was nothing the surface crew could do. We dropped nearly 200 feet in seconds before the emergency brake engaged. The sudden stop threw us against the interior walls, and I felt something crack in my shoulder. But the real terror came when we realized we were stuck. The bell had lodged itself against an underwater structure, and we were too deep for the backup systems to retrieve us safely. The umbilical cord supplying our air and heat was intact, but we had no idea for how long. The temperature inside the bell began dropping immediately. Without the constant circulation from the surface heaters, we were essentially sitting in a metal coffin surrounded by near-freezing water. Marcus and I huddled together, conserving body heat, while the surface crew worked frantically to devise a rescue plan. Hours turned into what felt like days. The cold was indescribable, seeping through our diving suits and into our bones. We took turns sleeping, though neither of us could manage more than brief moments of unconsciousness. The pressure at that depth meant any panic attack could be fatal, so we focused on controlling our breathing, on staying calm, on not thinking about the tons of water pressing against the bell's hull. On the second day, Marcus started showing signs of hypothermia. His speech became slurred, and he kept trying to remove his suit, insisting he was too hot. I had to physically restrain him, knowing that if he exposed himself to that cold, he'd be dead within minutes. It took 72 hours for the surface crew to maneuver a second diving bell down to our location. When they finally docked with us and opened the hatch, I looked at Marcus and barely recognized him. His lips were blue, his eyes unfocused. The rescue divers said later that we were within hours of organ failure. The decompression process took another 5 days. Slowly, gradually, they brought us back to surface pressure. During those long hours in the decompression chamber, I had plenty of time to think about my choices. I'd always known diving was dangerous, but I'd convinced myself that modern safety systems made it manageable. I never went back to saturation diving. Some fears you can overcome, some you can't. The nightmares lasted for years. Dreams of falling through darkness, of cold so intense it burned, of watching the pressure gauge as the numbers climbed higher and higher. Even now, I can't take elevators without feeling that drop in my stomach, that momentary panic that the cable might snap. Marcus wasn't as fortunate as I was. He developed severe PTSD and turned to alcohol to cope. Last I heard, he'd lost his family and was living in a facility for veterans and trauma survivors. Sometimes I wonder if I should have fought harder to help him, but the truth is, I was barely holding myself together. The ocean doesn't care about your experience or your precautions. It doesn't care about your family waiting on shore or your plans for the future. Down there in the deep, you're just another fragile human in a metal can, hoping the engineering holds and luck stays on your side.
Back in the winter of 2014, I was working as a commercial diver for an oil company off the coast of Norway. The pay was incredible, the kind of money that could set you up for life if you did it long enough, but the work was brutal. We'd spend weeks at a time living in pressurized chambers, making daily dives to depths most people can't even imagine. On February 3rd, I was down at 380 feet repairing a damaged pipeline when my umbilical cord got snagged on a piece of jagged metal. I didn't realize it at first, just felt a slight tug, but when I tried to move away from the pipe, the cord pulled taut and I couldn't go anywhere. I radioed topside to let them know I was stuck, and they told me to stay calm while they figured out what to do. But then I felt it, a slight give in the line, and I knew immediately what had happened. The cord was tearing. At 380 feet, the water pressure is over 165 pounds per square inch, and if that umbilical failed, I'd have maybe 30 seconds of air left in my bailout bottle before I'd start drowning in my own helmet. I tried to reach the snag point, but it was just out of range, behind me where I couldn't see it. My hands were shaking inside my gloves as I fumbled with the emergency release, trying to free myself from whatever was holding me. The topside crew was shouting instructions through my headset, telling me to hold still while they sent down another diver to help, but I could feel the cord continuing to fray. Every second felt like an hour down there in the darkness, with nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the distant hum of machinery. I started thinking about my wife, about how I'd promised her this would be my last season, that we'd use the money to buy that house we'd been looking at. I thought about my daughter's piano recital that I'd miss if I died down here, and how she'd never forgive me for breaking another promise. After what felt like forever, but was probably only about 8 minutes, I saw lights approaching through the murky water. It was Jensen, one of the most experienced divers on the crew, and he had a cutting torch with him. He signaled me to stay still, then moved behind me to assess the situation. Through the radio, I heard him tell Topside that it was bad, that the umbilical was caught on a sharp edge and had already torn through about 60% of the outer layers. He said he'd need to cut me free, and then we'd have to buddy breathe our way back to the diving bell. The next few minutes were the longest of my life. Jensen worked as fast as he could, but cutting through metal underwater is slow, precise work. I could feel my air supply getting weaker with each breath as the damaged umbilical struggled to deliver enough gas. Finally, I felt a jerk and then sudden freedom as Jensen cut through the obstruction. But now I was completely dependent on my bailout bottle, which had maybe 15 minutes of air if I stayed calm and controlled my breathing. We started making our way back to the bell, moving as quickly as we dared without risking decompression sickness. About halfway there, my bailout ran dry. I'd been breathing too fast, couldn't help it. The panic was setting in despite all my training. Jensen immediately switched to emergency protocols, sharing his air supply with me through a secondary regulator. We were pressed close together, moving in tandem through the dark water, and I could see the concern in his eyes through his helmet's faceplate. If anything happened to his air supply now, we'd both die down here. We finally reached the bell with maybe 2 minutes of air left in Jensen's supply, and as soon as that hatch sealed behind us and we started our ascent, I broke down completely, just collapsed against the wall and started crying like a child. The decompression took 18 hours, and I spent every minute of it replaying what had happened, thinking about how close I'd come to leaving my family without a husband and father. When we finally surfaced, I walked straight to the crew quarters, packed my bags, and quit on the spot. The company tried to convince me to stay, offered me a bonus, better shifts, whatever I wanted, but I was done. Some people can brush off near-death experiences and go right back to work, but I'm not one of them. That was 7 years ago, and I still have nightmares about being trapped in the dark, feeling that umbilical cord tearing, knowing that death is just seconds away. I work in an office now doing logistics for the same company, but from the safety of dry land. The pay isn't nearly as good, and sometimes I miss the adventure, the feeling of being one of the few humans who've been to those depths. But then I go home to my wife and daughter, and I remember why I made the choice I did. The ocean is beautiful and fascinating and full of wonders, but it's also utterly merciless. Down there in the deep, you're just a fragile sack of meat in a metal suit, and one small mistake can end everything in an instant.